if I can take my pleasure to introduce you, Yala, on behalf of the CHCI's Global Institute for the Humanities of 2019 in Santiago, Maurits van Beverdonk and I have the pleasure to introduce and moderate the session. Kisukidi is a maîtresse de conférence in philosophy at the University of Paris 8 at Vincennes Saint-Denis, and she is co-director of the research center Les Logiques Contemporaines de la Philosophie. Between 2014 and 2016, Kisukidi was vice president of the Collège International de Philosophie, and her studies on the thought of Henri Bergson, her book Bergson ou l'humanité créatrice, Bergson or Creative Humanity, with apologies to real translators, and her texts in the Annales Bergsoniennes, amongst others, have unfurled her engagement with aesthetics and politics into questions on the post-colonial condition and philosophy more generally. She has published many articles in the areas of Africana philosophy and French philosophy, and is currently completing a book on Black diasporas, which will appear with Éditions Amsterdam in 2020. Today's keynote address is in the form, as we see, of a video conference, which we hope will proceed without interference, and is titled Afrodiasporic Politics on Returning Home. Bienvenue, Yala Kisukidi.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for all this. I hope that you can hear me well. Is that fine? Okay. So I cannot see anybody, so it will be very strange to have a long 1 hour speech in front of all of you. And I just would love to thank you for your patience and for, the conditions, because I have some some health issues and I couldn't come in Chile, but I hope I will have the opportunity to come very soon in Santiago. And I would love to thank all the team of the CHCI for their confidence and for giving me the opportunity to speak in front of all of you. As Heidi said it, I'm finishing a book called Black Hope. And the lecture I want to present today is a part of a chapter I am writing, so it's not messy, but there are a lot of hypotheses, and so I think it will be very interesting to talk about it with you, but it's quite finished. And I just shorten the title, and it is just now Returning. There is also a little PowerPoint. I don't know if it is possible to mix all those technologies, so perhaps it will be easier for people to follow my talk, but if it is not possible, I will try to pick as slowly as I can, so it will be easy for everybody to understand what I say with these technological conditions and my French accent. So returning, Afrodiasporic political practices. African diasporas, wherever they are, involve dreams. Dreams in which one may reinterpret the past, invent new futures, imagine how to inhabit the present and settle within it. Yet there is one persistent and enduring dream, relentlessly encircling the mind, the desire to return. To return, that is, to return to the place one originates from, Africa. This desire may sound paradoxical when taken out of the diasporic imaginary. First, the word diaspora in itself is a word which must be handled with care, emerging in the 3rd century BCE in the Septuagint. It refers to the history of human groups, people, communities, which scattered in different locations and developed a transnational mode of existence. The diaspora must be thought as a diffracting, to quote Glissant, and multiplying unity. In each multiplication, in each reflection, the origin is no longer substantial. It is merely a trace, recalling the already distant native homeland and accounting, more or less consistently, for identification processes through which diasporas perceive and fantasize their unity. In this presentation, I would like to move away from the rhetoric of the national majority and from narratives of identity, whether identity is viewed as one or as many, and approach the question of a return to Africa differently. I would like to show how this desire to return, expressed on the European continent, may lead to the development of creative and subversive politics where knowledge and praxis reconcile. So I will explore these issues following 3 steps. That's very French, I'm sorry. I will first outline the many difficulties linked to the question of the return. Then I will show how this question can stem from an experience that has nothing to do with the fetishization of the origin. And I will conclude by outlining the main aspects of a praxis. But first of all, to start, I think it's early morning now in Santiago, so I would like just to tell you a story. A story that I would love to recount, that is not a sociology, not a narrative of the self. Rather, it is the story of 2 collective experiences, both related to the idea of the return. In July 2017, I was invited to participate in the 5th edition of the African Summer School in Verona, in Italy. The first edition had been sponsored by a minister, the first Black minister in Italy, called Cecile Kyenge, the former Italian minister for integration under the coalition government of Enrico Letta. The African Summer School is a summer school open to all African, Afrodiasporic, and European youth. It supports the development of entrepreneurial projects promoting a return to Africa by offering various courses, African philosophy, cultural studies, self-help, business, etc., etc. While the school is open to various ideological approaches, it is part of a wider African Renaissance project. This notion of African Renaissance, first coined by Cheikh Anta Diop in his writings, is subject to multiple complementary or conflicting interpretations. However, approached through the prism of Diop's reflection, the African Renaissance is a project aiming at the reconquest of historical initiative by African populations. The meaning of such reconquest can be further clarified. The reconquest of historical initiative should be understood as the reconquest of the ability to formulate, anticipate, undertake, create, invent, and innovate. In Cheikh Anta Diop's writings, the idea of an African Renaissance is an invitation to rethink Africa's emancipation process in its entirety without separating economic, cultural, scientific, and political issues. So these schools, these African summer schools, and the students of these schools, who are mostly Afro-Italians, focused on which economic model should be promoted in a Renaissance perspective. There were also concerns related to identity and culture, which are exacerbated by experiences of racism in Italy, of systematic racism in Italy, and the desire to return cannot dispense with a reflection on the refuge. That is to say, a safe place where one may gather up some strength and fully exploit the creative virtualities of his, her life without being subjected to the constant racial injunction, look a Negro, which reduces the possibilities of an existence. The second story, that is shorter, is that of an orientation trip for African and Afro-diasporic youth organized in Accra for the 16th anniversary of Ghana's independence in August 2017 also. Young people from West Africa meeting young Afro-Europeans from Belgium and France, investigating their relationship to the continent, exploring their desires to return, as well as the possibility to settle in Africa. This journey was in itself a significant action. It was the realization of a transcultural and transnational political solidarity, the celebration of Nkrumah's legacy, and the revival of Pan-African ideals, in spite of separation, the contrasting life stories, and the plurality of identities. The organizers' opening speech featured an explicit reference to Glissant and to his criticism of root identities. What unites those who are apart is a project, not a given, a culture, biology, an identity, and it is the defense of African and Afro-descendant lives in Africa and everywhere else in the world. Both experiences, in a way, achieve the reconciliation between knowledge and praxis, which the Congolese philosopher Valentin Mudimbe called for in many of his books. The short presentation I have made here is very subjective, but those who have had similar experiences, of course, may not necessarily relate to it. Personally, I went through those experiences by trying to infuse them with what I wanted to see, and that I was hoping to find the possibility to assert my double presence in Europe and Africa on a political level without being subjected to racial categorization. To be doubly present, all the while being fiercely unassimilable and unauthentic, as the poet Leopold Sédar Senghor put it, assimilate, don't be assimilated. So through those two experiences, there are many experiences of return now in the Afro-European diaspora. I would love to try how we can understand and how we can just conceive a kind of a political understanding of what can be a diaspora. So first, what are the difficulties and of this desire to return, and why can it be suspicious? The idea of a return to Africa has a long history which structures Pan-African thinking as well as the different expressions of Black nationalism. Its geography, the geography of the return, is primarily that of the Atlantic Triangle, Europe, Africa, the Americas, around which several typical return routes are traced. It is fueled by the dreams of slaves deported to the Americas who imagined their escape and their liberation. It takes shape in the plans to massively send blacks back to Africa devised by slave states, a plan which gave birth, for example, to Sierra Leone. It brings together the maritime, political, and entrepreneurial initiatives of Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line, and drives the desire for a promised land expressed by the members of the Rastafarian movement in Jamaica. The history of returns to Africa, which starts with the Atlantic slave trade, follows various paths: desires to escape, eviction plans, separation policies, etc., etc. The desire to return to Africa, a continent seen as the exclusive reference unifying those who have been forced to scatter through violence and coercion, is not dead today. It still exists in the contemporary world, and more particularly in European Afrodiasporic worlds. We could, from the outset, be wary of such persistent desires to return and of the narratives they construct. We could be wary of them because of where they are formulated, that is, Europe. We could be wary of them because these desires seem to immediately point towards a failure. The creolization processes shaping the globalized world have not destroyed the desire to subjectively identify with the land, with some kind of permanent roots, with what is fixed, and even with the idea of a nation. The idea of the return carries with it the murderous virtualities of what Glissant called atavistic cultures, forms of cultural identification focused on the idea of a single root and based on the principle of a genesis and the principle of a line of descent in order to seek legitimacy on a land which, from that moment on, becomes a territory. Being neither creative nor subversive, the desire to return then appears to be a rehash of the age-old argument which links cultural authenticity to exclusive national and territorial roots. There appears to be no emancipatory political virtualities in this desire because it is undermined by the following three characteristics: the feeling of being privileged, an obsession with identity, and a fascination with majority narratives. What do I call first the feeling of being privileged? The first what is suspicious with the desire of return expressed from an Afro-European point of view and situation, it is that it can embody a kind of diasporic privilege. What can I call a diasporic privilege? In the current European context, the desire to return to Africa violently clashes against the reality of migrations from Africa towards Europe, and more precisely against the issue of how refugees and asylum seekers are welcomed. I am not trying to oppose a desire to return to Africa to another, more powerful desire, the desire for Europe. Europe is not the first destination for African migrants, that must be said, even when particular situations of oppression and violence force the populations to seek refuge. Usually they just go on the countries that are just next to their place. Migrations from Africa to Europe in their diversity show Western policies to be firmly rooted in form of policing, defining relegation zones, erecting walls, pushing back migrants on the border, identifying undesirable immigrants. These anti-immigration policies, which do not distinguish between economic migrations and political refugees, trace the outlines of new barbarism, to quote the writer Patrick Chamoiseau. Faced with these forms of politics rooted in forms of policing, the desire to return, expressed from the Afro-European perspective, reveal what is unmentionable. Their conditions of utterance are that of a privileged position. A privilege is a right, an exclusive advantage possessed by a group or an individual which contravenes the common rules. The desire to return in this way appears to be a diasporic privilege, de facto, relying on a right of residence or a birthright. Not just a jus sanguinis, but a right linked to one's legal status and to a territory's attractiveness. That is, to being born in a powerful national space administered in such a way that the national's ability to travel are not hampered by heavy-handed security and migration policies which, on a global scale, define areas certain populations are prevented from leaving. As such, the diasporic privilege appears to be the privilege of diasporas that have been able to settle or grow in wealthy nation-states which provide the privilege of never having to come up against sealed borders. The desire to return to Africa, expressed from Afro-descendants born or living in Europe, appears first and foremost to be the sublimated expression of a factual, legal, and administrative reality. Some territories offer indefinite freedom of movement, as well as the ability to fully enjoy the advantages given by a citizenship. Afro-European diasporas, however diverse in their itineraries, may well be primarily European diasporas. Seen through the prism of suspicion, the desires to return they harbor may appear as the dreams of privileged populations, the sublimation of a personal want linked to the desire to know a relative or a close one's homeland, far from any geopolitical or material concerns. These dreams ignore the reality of police borders, checks, and migrations movements. These are the first condemnations and critiques you can find of this desire of return. There are two other critiques. Usually, these desires of return to Africa are despised as an obsession with identity and a kind of fascination by majority narratives. So, obsession with identity. When it is not the expression of a diasporic privilege, the desire to return may appear as a dream overflowing with identity obsessions. They endlessly repeat the patterns of the nationalistic rhetoric that has structured European narratives and political practices since the 19th century. In the Black Atlantic, Gilroy says that we should remain wary of diasporic narratives which rhetoricalized based on the unifying reference to a soil and a continent. Under this perspective, the idea of the return remains tied to political and poetical imaginaries related to romantic modern approaches to culture. The creation of popular forms of solidarity necessarily implies the defense of an authentic national cultural life. Yet, according to Gilroy, the political and poetic power of diasporas precisely consists in radically breaking the connection between the notions of people and community on the one hand and those of cultural authenticity and roots on the other. The experiences undergone by Black African diasporas who have gone through exile, displacement, and relocation allow for the creation of a critical frame aimed at disqualifying any use of a homogeneous and reified concept in the field of Euro-American and Afro-diasporic politics. The Black Atlantic refers to this political, transcultural, and transnational form, which represents an active criticism of ethnical and cultural absolutism. Islands, archipelagos, and the seas are preferred to the continent. Nomadic variations are preferred to static sedentary life. Against the narrative of established roots, it is the idea of rhythm identity, a relational identity, that is advocated. The idea of the nation-state is replaced by a transnational political utopia. As a consequence, the idea of return is opposed with processes of heterological self-construction, integrating the other, any other possible place in the definition of individuals, peoples, and communities. The political imaginaries related to the notion of diaspora should legitimately free us from the ideas of nation, land, soil, and continent. The need for a return reduces the emancipatory possibilities legitimately entailed by a diasporic life. Third condemnations of this idea of return, what we could call the majority narratives. The need for a return to the continent in these ways appears to be another delusion. Even when they experience movement, multiplicity, and disaffiliation, Afro-diasporic communities may be seduced by narratives about territory and identity. Afro-French, Afro-American, Afro-British, etc., Afro-Chilean, before the national affiliation features the expressionless monomaniac repetition of the prefix Afro as a sign of the individual's origin. This instance, when it is not the consequence of some external injunction but a claim made in the first person, is somewhat disappointing. It completely ruins the creative and political potential carried by the notion of diaspora itself. The capacity to disaffiliate from the nation, to break the logics of borders and administrations, and to create new forms of plurality that will be indifferent to the question of the origin. It may be useful here to go back to the thinker Richard Marienstrass analyzes. He's a French Jewish thinker from the 70s, a leftist from the left. At the heart of his reflections about diaspora lies a following question, which he raised about French Jewish diasporas in the 70s, in a very different context. His question is the following: do the permanence and identity of the Jewish diaspora rely on Israel's central position as a nation state? More generally, the belief in a nation state is seen as the only form of normality. It dispels any doubt one may have over the future of the identity that is being constructed. For diasporic becomings, the idea of a nation state provides the illusion of ontological consistency. This belief brings down any identity politics to two patterns: assimilation, integration on the one hand, or separation on the other hand. Assimilation implies the dissolution of the other in the same. Integration is an injunction mechanism through which the other must meet the expectations of the same, or they will face sanctions. Separations refer to a radical disjunction between the other and the same, which may or may not involve the division of a territory. But diasporas, in order to exist as such, and whatever their characteristic may be, must not adopt the logic of existing nationalities, to quote Marienstrass. Rather, they should assume a sui generis life form by asserting themselves as transnational and transcultural minorities. The word minorities does not mean that a group is numerically smaller than a state's general population. It does not necessarily mean that a population is minoritized. In other words, despised and relegated to peripheral areas. The term minorities refers to an undermining of a majority system. That is, a system of hegemonic norms defining a set of dominant codes and social practices within a nation state. What is suggested by Marienstrass' writing, once they are taken out of their historical context, which is possible, is that when diasporic imaginaries and practices resort to the logics of nation states, or in Glissant words, to the logic of territories, they legitimize majority narratives, in which the cultural life and the political life are both ruled by the state. The desire to return may be interpreted as the validation of these narratives by numerically smaller groups, which are often minoritized in the West. However, I would like to show that against those three difficulties and those three condemnations that are usually used against the idea of return, another understanding of this desire to return may be developed, which leaves no room for these forms of suspicion, that is to say, diasporic privilege, obsession with identity, and legitimization of majority narratives. And to understand that, we have to explore a kind of a singular experience that must be acknowledged, and I will call this experience the experience of the absent community. And this will be the second part of this lecture, exploring the experience of the absent community. The experience of the absent community. Returning, because usually of the impossibility to belong. First, the impossibility to belong to communities in Europe which revive murderous glorifications of soil and ethnicity, which unify around a shared bitterness, to quote Cheikh Anta Diop, and harbor nostalgia for their past imperial greatness. Second, the impossibility to belong to societies in Africa itself because you have never lived there, because there is no family there waiting, because it is a continent which also generates rejection, lines of racial exclusion, and forms of xenophobia, sometimes inherited and sometimes not, from the history of colonization. This impossible belongings features asymmetries, but they shed light on what an Algerian sociologist, Abdelmalek Sayad, called in a very different context for the Algerian diaspora in France, the double absence. Double absence, what does it mean? In Africa and in Europe, Afrodiasporic individuals are seen as exogenous subjects summoned to identify themselves. This double absence refers to the exposure of diasporic subjects to the violence of race, chauvinism, and xenophobia, to the material violence of race, chauvinism, and xenophobia. The proliferation of this imperious summons is central to the experience of the absent community. The idea of the community, harking back to a nostalgia for fusion and transparency, might seem like a vague notion providing an ancestral and idealized vision of the social fact. This notion has been irretrievably lost in the way political modernity considers the totality of the social. But I would love to use a writer that I read a lot, and that I read in a very decolonial way. I don't know if it is possible, but anyway, I'll do it. It is Maurice Blanchot, and in his marvelous book called La Communauté Inavouable, so I think it is translated this way in English, the unavowable community. I don't know if this is the good translation in English, but we'll try that. So in this book, La Communauté Inavouable, Blanchot argues that the term community usually refers to two types of social groupings which can be difficult to sort out. On the one hand, the traditional community, a de facto sociality imposed on us without our having the liberty of choice in the matter. On the other hand, the elective community, a social form which exists only through a decision that gathers its members around the choice without which it could not have taken place. These constructing conceptions of the community both involve processes of identification, which entail strategies of recognition and logics of assignation, and distributes body inside or outside the boundaries or community defines for itself. Every community lays down a condition to the reception of newcomers, that the person who, for various reasons, is asking to be let in and to settle down, be identified. The processes of identification are not only descriptive, compiling the defining features of an individual, but also normative and prescriptive. They involve a number of expectations. They determine what one must be and do to be part of the community and satisfy its requirements, what it means to truly be French or Congolese, to authentically be European or African, for instance. To experience the absent community is to always experience this injunction to be identified, upon which rejection or acceptance are hinged. The experience of the absent community is not the experience of the community's absence. The community's absence can be compensated, made up for. It refers to a situation of privation or to a lack which can be filled. It refers to what is missing as something which is always specified and defines the form of what is sought. So to experience the absent community is to be confronted with the fact that no one is willing to support the possibilities of an existence unless that existence is first identified. But this demand of identification is paradoxical because it requires identification from one who has already been categorized, that is to say, that has already been identified as Black, Arabic, Muslim, veiled African, in France, for example, and this identified person we are asking for identification is usually declared as unassimilable. So this demand of identification repeats the gesture of exclusion upon which the community's borders are reaffirmed. The criteria of identification, be it racial, national, or cultural, are set a priori. Experiencing the absent community is experiencing a naked and systematic exposure to an inquiring, controlling, judging, and surveying eye, whether it belongs to the established order, army, police, administration, school, party, etc., or to the neighboring environment, family, work, colleagues, etc. The eye watching the individual, unbeknownst to the latter, and unmasking him guarantees the community's unity. So the experience of the absent community cannot be compensated. It refers to the systemicity of an experience of relegation which produces an assimilability, an authenticity, and not being integrated, an integrationality. Subjects experiencing it carry the constant awareness of their constitutive inadequacy, of their impossibility to be with and to be part of a given community, wherever they be. And this experience of absent community can be seen as the most expressive experience of what a diasporic life can be. So how do I connect this experience of absent community with the idea of return, and especially in my context, the idea of return to Africa? The experience of the absent community always suggests the existence of a subject navigating between various places. Neither tragic, guilty, or bitter, the experience of the absent community drives us away from issues of identity, whether cultural or national. It opens up the possibilities for a political practice in which the forsaken dreams of community reveal once again in their wake the question of the return. Where do you return to when you feel absent from every and any community? Where do you return to when you are inadequate? Why insist on returning when the very issue of provenance and origin no longer bears any meaning for a scattered population? To feel absent from Africa, to feel absent from Europe, to feel absent from the place where you were born and where your parents come from, to feel absent from the place where you are being raised and where you actually live. This double absence, to requote Abdelmalek Sayad, speaks to the biographical singularity of inadequate lives. It speaks to a suffering, to the internal conflicts of a double consciousness, to borrow from Du Bois. But it also contains a practical question addressed to the doubly absent. How can you explore, reinvent your presences, your doubles, your multiple inadequate presences in this world? The double absence takes on added meaning, becoming a necessity. How can you invent your double inadequate presence in national and social spaces whose only way of claiming or recognizing their own seems to by assimilating them or demanding that they boast the signs of their integration? How can this double presence be invented in Africa and in Europe at the same time? How can the conditions of possibility of a double habitability be created? Not only in the administrative and legal form of a dual citizenship, but in a concrete and political form by creating actual possibilities of inhabiting several places at the same time. To inhabit, as in, to live in a territory where the possibilities of human existence are not violently hampered and where the material means of subsistence which ensure decent living conditions are guaranteed. The issue of the return takes on a new turn, resurfacing as a political claim tied to the continuous back and forth between Africa and Europe. The utopian virtualities suggested by the notion of diaspora are not derived from the idea of even individuals as bearing multiple identities, but from the fact that they embody the political contradictions tied to the choice of being inadequately present in several places. These political contradictions take on a specific form in the case of Afrodiasporic lives in Europe. These lives are often spent in the big European centers, Paris, Brussels, London, Lisbon, Berlin, where tragic continuities still connect the colonial past to the neo-colonial present. The relationships between the European Western worlds and African worlds are asymmetrical, based on relationships of economic predation, since the conditions of growth and profusion that certain ways of life require rely on the exploitation and prioritization of other worlds and populations. The necessity of returning to Africa, expressed from Europe, it conveys a politics. This politics does not only explore identities, whether they are whole or wounded, but rather addresses the contradictions issuing from the desire to live in places whose mutual relationship is structured by relation of inequality and dominance. Living a decent and serene life in these places requires that we abolish a geopolitics of inequality which targets overpopulation and useless or disposable lives. The claim to a double inadequate presence, a multiplied inadequate presence in the world, based neither on identity nor morals, revives a revolutionary praxis, to quote Mudimbe. The necessity of a return and of those back and forth, as conveyed by Afro-diasporic dreams in Europe, is repoliticized beyond issues of culture and identity, which becomes secondary. The return is not to go home, but to create the conditions through which familiar places where for various reasons it was not possible to stay or settle may now be inhabited. The diasporic life harbors utopian political virtualities, those of an internationalism that is no longer abstract but situated. This internationalism is not an idealized approach of the becomings of the world, theoretically predicated on a shared humanity. It deals with the concrete modalities of action carried out by subjects concerned by the futures of places which have forged and still forge today their attachments and their biographies. So in a very concrete way, what do we do with this comprehension, with this political comprehension of the diasporic life and his connection to the return? And this will be my third and last part of this lecture. So I call this part Praxis, Back and Forth, and Geopolitics of Hope, to quote Arjun Appadurai. Terms, Geopolitics of Hope. Geography of Hope, sorry. So back and forth and solidarities. The desire to return, considered outside of notions of identity and authenticity, points to a politics of solidarity involving mutual attachments and commitments, mindful of the well-being of Afro-descendant populations all over the world. While these solidarities may result from shared experiences beforehand, the commonality they produce only comes as a result. There is no established community prior to the formations of solidarity. Identity is not the same as solidarity. The former is a given, one that is more or less fantasized or thoroughly manufactured. The latter is a political construct which does not involve any pre-existing given and promotes an emancipatory project upon which ties can be built. The return to Africa and the back and forth it involves can be understood as a solidarity political projects. Those projects do not refer to an ethics built upon the assistance to subjects deemed fragile and vulnerable, humanitarian reason, or seen as lagging behind, co-development. They support the co-creation of egalitarian spaces against the proliferation of outwardly spaces in which normalized processes of violence abound. To understand this, I think it's very important to reread Césaire today, and especially to reread a beautiful lecture he did for the first Congress of the Black artists and writers in Paris at the Sorbonne in 1956. And in this essay, what is important is that Césaire tried to define, he does not use the term diaspora, which is still a very complicated term, but he tries to understand a diasporic blackness through not the idea of identity, but the idea of solidarity. And to understand the black diaspora, you have to understand two kinds of solidarity, what he calls solidarity in time and horizontal solidarity. I just would love to explain those two kinds of solidarities. So solidarities in time and horizontal solidarity. Solidarity in time first from Césaire. Solidarity in time underlines differentiated and plural memories of an uprooting harking back to the brutal separation from Africa. In the 21st century, the return of Afro-European diasporas to Africa can be, of course, viewed as a cultural enterprise, as a return to the initial unity. But most importantly, this enterprise does not involve, when we reread it through Césaire, any individual re-education which will push subjects to a form of confession or submit them to truth procedures designed to prove that they have not been contaminated by the trappings of whiteness and the West. These solidarities in time describe the possible unity of the heterogeneous, neither normative nor prescriptive. They are satisfied with the unassimilable, the inauthentic. Such solidarities are not punitive. The ties they build are not grounded in guilt. So this is the first conceptions of solidarity that linked the black diaspora. But I'm more interested in the second one, what Césaire called the solidarity, the horizontal solidarity, and I would love to use this one to understand the question of the diaspora linked to the problem of the return. So Césaire mentions another type of solidarity, the idea of the horizontal solidarity that ties the bond and the links between black diasporas on a global scale. Césaire argues that beyond the same harsh reality which must be embraced, the reality of colonial and para-colonial situations, the solidarities engage in a fight and convey a political dynamic of hope. Such solidarities allow us to explore the dynamics of the return outside of any strictly cultural frameworks, that is to say, solidarity in time. What built in the diaspora's movement of back and forth between Europe and Africa is, most importantly, a geopolitics of hope. a geopolitics grounded in minoritarian dynamics rather than a mere analytics of territorial conflicts and power ratios between states at a global level. The geopolitics of hope that are carried by this idea of horizontal solidarity refer to the political reinvestment of a space from a minoritarian perspective. The global stage is structured by the borders defined by states. They hinder the movements of human lives while ensuring, through a system of rules, the free movement of capitals and goods. These asymmetrical logics of borderizations, to quote Bembe, of the world structure the various power ratios within contemporary neoliberalism. They account for the social and political imbalances and for asymmetries between the Norths and the Souths. Subverting these power ratios constitutes the very hope conveyed by the movement of back and forth of diasporas between Europe and Africa. Subverting them in the places where they are produced and in the places that they affect, so that wherever we live, no force may smother or destroy the possibilities of our lives. So, to conclude, practices. What kind of practices this comprehension of diaspora can bring through this idea of return? The necessity to return, and this was my purpose, can be grasped in a strictly political dimension in connection with the material critique of inequalities. This political claim arises outside of narratives of identity and majority and of neocolonial suspicions tied to the diasporic privilege. By forsaking the impossible dream of adhering to a given community, the experience of the absent community, it defines the shape of a solidarity political practice, one that is situated and encourages us to re-explore the concepts of the nation-state, of sovereignty, and of territory, as well as the contemporary reconfigurations of imperialism. Returns can take three concrete forms: settling without coming back, forgetting Europe and returning to a continent where you may never have been and without any family there waiting. Returns can means coming and going, living in two places without favoring one of the two. And return can mean also staying in order to live, that is to say, staying in Europe to prepare the material conditions of the return. In all three cases, the places in tension are invested in a singular way on affective and political levels. The forgetting of Europe, the life in between, the delayed returns are all elements which tell stories of humiliation and failure as well as tales of power. They involve various types of practices which produce an impact on the places of departure and arrival. Three examples to finish. Formulated from Europe, claims to Afro-descendants and projects of returning have opened up a vast space of creation in political and legal fields, calling to disrupt national narratives, to hinder the reproduction of inequalities affecting the functioning of institutions, to complicate the history of European nation-states, to contribute to the dismantling of narratives grounded in hierarchies of rejection, and to oppose conservative political forces fostering logics of exclusion based on the interconnection of categories of gender, race, and class, and to simultaneously address issues of representation and reparation, the right to voluntary mobility, and immigration policies, to promote the habitability of Europe as a continent freed from post-colonial melancholy and historical fantasies of fortification. In Africa, the practices which stem from such returns prompt us to challenge the legal codes pertaining to nationality, to further the continent's unity beyond the violence of chauvinism, of walls and borders that are more or less contested, protected or erased under sand, trafficking and arms. The point is to re-examine the relationship between Africans in Africa by relentlessly fighting off the various reconfigurations of racism and xenophobia permeating the continent as a whole. But the aim is also to re-explore the continent's relationship to its diasporas, which suggests, at the very least, that we challenge the legal principle of an exclusive citizenship in countries like DRC or Cameroon, implementing it. More broadly, what role could diasporas play in the elaboration of the continent's political becomings? And last example, across Europe and Africa floats a continuous hope inspired by the long history of Black and Afro-descendant solidarities, working to undo the inequality that has structured the relationships between the two continents, calling into question the franc CFA. I don't know if you have heard about that. That's the money built by France that still linked all the past of West African. And there are a lot of movements, grassroots movements in France, in Africa, in Europe, fighting against the franc CFA. So calling into question the franc CFA, calling out the practices of the old empire, military operations, soft power. For example, Francophonie can be seen as a soft power, and which at times still define the ties between Western powers and their former colonies. All those things are examples of a political reinvention by the diaspora themselves or their double inadequate presence in Europe and in Africa. The notions of return explore circulations, movements, and migrations, but also invite us to reflect on what settling down truly means. All forms of settlement are not necessarily mothers of conquest, an inextinguishable desire of taking roots. Settling also means creating the conditions of possibility for a strong life in which you can stand on your own 2 feet. To have a roof over your head, a shelter to protect you, to see your family stay, grow, sometimes move away, come and go, to create lasting ties, to live in a place where life is not threatened. In situations where military, racial, economical, gendered, and imperial violence interpenetrate, the desire to return runs counter to the praise of migrations as the exemplification of an ideal cosmo-citizenship. It promotes a politics eager to take apart the logics of predation and to contribute instead to reinforcing habitable places. As such, the desire to return, and this will be my final word, I promise, as such, the desire to return does not always find an echo in reactionary intellectual traditions. The attachments to places forging a biography is not necessarily nurtured by a fetishism of origins. Certain experiences of the return are not content with melancholies of loss. They trace a political path far from the paths of assimilation and separation, reasserting the double presence of unauthentic and untiring subjects. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yala. That was absolutely exhilarating. And I think we were at the Museum of Memory and Human Rights yesterday, and there are many questions that emerged through that in relation to conversations from the first day that you have brought together in quite a singular and grounded offering and itinerary, which I think there will be a lot of questions and comments. So I'm going to open up and ask Moritz to assist me in...
Could you hear all the lecture?
We heard everything perfectly. Thank you.
Cool.
You want us to sit? Okay, Yala, Moritz and I are going to move to the top of the room, and then we're going to take the rounds of questions and comments. Okay, give us a minute.
Okay, so as Heidi said, we'll take a round of 3 questions, and then we'll give Yala a chance to respond, and then go forward like that. So, who wants to start? Okay.
Thank you so much for this wonderful and inspiring lecture. I really, truly enjoyed it. So my question has to do with sort of a more practical issues that would arise from this diasporic subject that you have described. And it is the question of law. In a certain way, the question of law, in a certain way which you described as this diasporic subject who is in between, melancholic but not really. My question is, to what law is this diasporic subject subjected? Because if there is no subject before the law, how do we deal with the question and the relation of subject and law in this situation? Would that require completely rethinking of law? And have you thought about that at all?
Okay, Handa? And then Adriana after that.
The word was law, and yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And you had a emphasis on geography throughout your talk, and I was curious to hear more about the temporality aspect, since the experience of diaspora seems to be stranded between a nostalgia of the past and a utopian idea for the future, a hopeful future for that. I'm curious to know more about the political potential of the present. What does the present hold stuck in between those, the past and the future? And a smaller question would be related to the idea of solidarity. And I always think about solidarity in relation to solitude, because I think the experience of diaspora and exile is an experience of solitude as well, and that is not always mentioned. And I would like to hear more about what you think about the political potential that solitude has alongside solidarity. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, this works. So thank you so much. I work on Hebrew and Israeli literature, so I spend a lot of time thinking about diaspora in the Jewish context. And I was really interested in thinking about this model and how it unsettles the idea of Jewish diaspora. But then the question it raises for me is how the model of an absent community accounts for diaspora such as the Jewish one, where there's a textual tradition that allows for a very material, textual persistence of origin, territory, and language. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Yala, when you're ready, you can deal with those, and then we'll carry on.
I can answer. Thank you for those marvelous questions. And as I told you, I have this is the part, the chapter I'm writing, and you all know that when we write, usually you see that the words are not the good ones. And I have a problem with the word diaspora because as the last question has to put it and underline it, I think it's not possible to understand the question of diaspora without delinking it from the question of origin. So I will try to answer to your question very shortly and in a very precise way. I would love to start with the second one. The question of solitude, I think, is very important because I think this question is at the core of the experience of what I try to call the absent community, that is to say, not to belong. And at the end, you have just reimagined your identity, and when you are faced to communities that are supposed to bring and to emphasize those identity, you see that you don't belong because you are always seen as inadequate. And I don't know if it could be relevant for your question, but perhaps this experience of inadequation is an experience of solitude. But what I would love to do is not to, I'm not a dialectic thinker, and usually when I see negativity, I always see positivity. So that's why I think that the expression of Abdelmalek Sayad, the double absence, can be resignified in a positive way by just an inadequate presence. And my question is, not how do you confirm to become adequate, which will be the most hysterical, the most crazy things to do. But my question is, can we do something politically of this experience of inadequacy? Is there something that can be interesting to think about through this experience of diasporic life that can lead us to solitude, to inadequacy? Is there something interesting to do politically? And is there a way to think about it in a very political way, that is to say, in a materialistic way? That was I was interested in. So I would say perhaps that the expression of solitude that you are pointing has something to do with the experience of inadequacy, of not being able to be a part of a community. And you know that when you want to belong, when you force yourself to belong, you already know that you are lying and that you are trying to do some things with who you are that is a kind of that hurts and destroys you in a way. So this is how I would answer to this question. And of course, the question of the temporality is very present. And I didn't, my book is called Black Hope. And the question of hope is very important. And in French, we have two ways to talk about hope. We use the very literal term espoir, hope. And we have a more theological term, espérance. I don't know how you say, I don't know, I think it's this hope also in English. And I like this term of esperance because, of hope, esperance, because you cannot understand it without having a certain understanding of temporality. And I think that the category of espérance is not a category linked to the past, nostalgia. It's not a category linked to the future, to the possibility to reveal a new world that is about to come, because the new world is never about to come. But it is the category of the presence, how you are able to stand up in the presence and just to transform it here and now. So it is possible, I don't know, to understand this question of esperance without having a kind of ethical projection that is at the end always betrayed. All our ethical projection are always betrayed. So I would love to use this category of hope and those categories of return by implement them in the present, not in the past of the nostalgia and not in the future. And I think that you could say perhaps after this question, I don't know if I was clear. If I'm not clear at all, just say, please stop, you're not clear at all. But I like the idea of return because to me, it's really possible not to link it to this, what you were calling a kind of nostalgia. It has really to do, I think, with how you are confronted in your own life with the fact of being a kind of a diasporic being. And those contradictions are here. And I think that you can understand this double presence in a very materialistic way, linked to a category, the category of the present. And I love the category of the present, not because, we African, we don't have history, of course, but because we don't have this fantasy of melancholia, of past. And I think that, for example, the memories are not interrupted, even by colonialism. And that also, I think that the future is always, it's very Benjaminian, but is always betraying us. So how to be able to still have a certain praxis without projecting too much in the future, without having those categories that will always be disappointing when we see our realizations. So I don't know if I could answer very well to your question, but this is what it made me think of. So after, about the question of the Jewish diaspora, I think that the question you point is very important because it shows, perhaps for my lecture, I am not destroying it, of course, but that perhaps you cannot use the term diaspora in a large way. Perhaps it's only a specific term related to a group and to a specific history. And what is happening? So I don't know what I was. Oh yes, perhaps. And I think that the idea of diaspora itself rebrings the question of the origins. But for the absent community, I think that this is the experience of inadequation and of being torn without never being authentic and assimilable can also be an experience that is lived by, that can be lived also when you belong to the Jewish diaspora. And I don't think that the question of the textual tradition, and we have also, there is a Black textual tradition. The date is perhaps the first Black textual tradition, depends how you understand how the question of the Black in itself subject arises in our world. But you can face, I don't know, a Black textual tradition from Africa. During the Arabic Islamic trade, you had a lot of discourses of the reason of a Black consciousness. You can also trace other cartographies of Black textual tradition from what happened from the great betrayal of the Atlantic Ocean and all the slave trades that reveal the histories of the Americas, South America and North America. And you have also other Black traditions that are now redoing themselves from, all those circulations between Africa, Europe, the Americas, now Asia. So there are many traditions and that are that do not have the same history, that do not have the same beginning. But I think that the question of the origins, Africa, of textual tradition, and could also be of even the question of languages, the way they were creolized themselves, how you can hear sometimes when you go to Cuba or Haiti in some Creole, how I can hear the language of the country of my father. So I think there are all those recreations that you can also see in Black traditions, intellectual and aesthetic and traditions. So I would say perhaps, and I don't know if you will agree with me, that this question of absent community could fit for any experiences of the diasporic life. And when I read, for example, someone like Richard Marienstrass, I think that when he talks about the Jewish community in France in the 70s, he expresses something like the will to remain inadequate and being accent in a way to majority narratives, but also to any community. So I think this could be not a shared experience, but that this expression could work for other situations, but that has to be recreated. And at the end, I think I didn't really understand the question because at the beginning I heard war and not law. So you were talking about law. Is that it? Yeah? Thumbs up or down? Okay. Law, yeah. And I did a reflection of subject and law, but more in racial theory, but it has nothing to do with it. And in this context, more to understand the question of the citizenship, and especially of the double nationality and all the kind of problems it brings with the possibility to reinforce and to make this experience of the double inadequate presence concrete. So I would answer this way. It's very, very light. I'm totally aware of it, but this is only the path I follow with this question of law. But it's not very consistent now in the work I do.
Thank you, Yala. I think we should take another round of questions, or if people want to come back on questions. Wow, everybody. Let's start on the left and just work around. Yeah. So, Baba.
I don't hear. I don't know if somebody is talking, but I don't hear anything.
Oh, there we go. Merci. Merci bien pour votre discours qui est si profond et pertinent. Je m'appelle Baba. I'm going to pose my question in English for the audience here. My question to you is that I'm going to take keywords from your talk that is really profound: return, blackness, race, Africa, the Americas, Europe. So I wonder whether you can say more that this idea that blackness for us is defined as different in the US, in Africa, in Europe. And I don't think that is true. I think what is really moving about your talk is this idea of the ghostly return, which is sort of like a device for the glimpse of freedom. Blackness is defined for us as different, but I don't think it's different. It's all related. So I wonder whether you can say a word or two about that.
Yeah, the sound was very. The sound was not good, and your question is very important. Did you say that the idea is to usually define blackness in different ways in the US, in Africa? And what you want to know is if I do promote those ideas that blackness is different from everywhere, or if there is a link or a kind of shared blackness, a shared concept of blackness, I would say, that we can draw or underline. Was that the question?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, perfect.
Gabriela?
Okay, I would like to rethink some of your thoughts from the question of filiation and affiliation, because both are general sources of desire as well as disavowal. And I really like that you emphasize there's a politics embedded in desire. And I think that politics for me is linked in how one negotiates filiation and affiliation. Now, this said, I think that negotiation is a task that everybody faces in today's world. And so I'm very interested in seeing how do we trace the specificities of this task for diasporic populations and especially the Black diaspora. And if I understood the gist of where you are going right, you linked the specificities very much to a politics of nostalgia and melancholia, but on the other side also belonging and hope. And my question is, could you say a little more about what of this task you consider as a general task for citizens in the global world versus a specific task for diasporic populations?
Jane. Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a brilliant talk. I just was very struck often by your juxtaposition of the nation state, sort of imaginary of the nation state, and it's being replaced by this kind of transnational diasporic identity. And I was wondering if you could comment on the afterlives of what I call in my work a Westphalian consciousness, the Treaty of Westphalie. What is it in French? The Treaty of Westphalia, 1648? Does anybody know what it is? Do you know, Yala, what I'm talking about? 1648, the origin of the nation's states, allegedly, in the Westphalian system. And there has been much controversy, obviously, over the past decade or so, that we are in a post-Westphalian, globalized world of movement and ability. But as you indicated, of course, our refugee populations are facing walls based on a kind of neo-Westphalian model. And so I'm wondering where your diasporic thinking intersects with some of this theorization of the afterlives of Westphalian logic.
Did you get all of that, Yala? Oh dear, we can't hear you.
No, I cut off my microphone.
Okay. Okay, so if you can respond to those, and then we'll continue.
I have to answer now? Was that the question? Yeah, okay. Because I cannot hear you anymore, so I'm talking on my own. So the question, the first question of blackness, I think it's a very important question. Very. And I think that, I don't want to use and to draw a hagiography of Césaire, but I think that the first person who understood the question of blackness to me is Césaire in a way, because he doesn't escape the problem of the different blacknesses in the world, and he doesn't want also to erase the fact that there are different experiences. And I think that we can I would talk about blackness, not by using race, because I think that there is a very dialectical connection from blackness and race, and this connection is always dialectical. But I would say that really the best way to think about blackness is to think it in terms of solidarity. That is to say that I think blackness is a project. And when Césaire says that there is also a solidarity in time and a horizontal solidarity, he says that you can do whatever you want. You're not obliged to think, and that's what the many Creole thinkers are doing. You're not obliged to refer yourself to the black identity, and you're not obliged to refer yourself to the Africa. But I think that the best way to understand blackness is to think about it as a kind of a solidarity, a horizontal solidarity. And there is just to quote Césaire, I remember just the beginning of this lecture. This is called Culture and Colonization, which is a lecture that I really love, because it is very profound. But I remember that he was there sitting he starts it this way. He was at the Congress, where there are so many writers, black writers, coming from all parts of the world, the Caribbean, South America, Americas, Africa, Europe. And he's just saying one thing, and that is the question of blackness, I think. Why are we all there? And to answer to the question of blackness is just, why are we all there? What kind of solidarities are we able to create through this word black? So to me, the blackness can be understood as a shared political project, but it's not a given, because the exposure to racial violences, I think, are really different. The experience of the Atlantic betrayal, the experience of this garden of the Congo of Leopold in the Central Africa are different experiences. But I think that through this racial oppression, there is something like a shared political blackness that can be built. This is the way I would answer to this question. But to me, it is still a very complicated question. And I think that to understand with the most, how can I say, in the most relevant way, the question of blackness is to understand that you are always trapped in a kind of aporia. The aporia of the kind of, perhaps, I think it's not a shared experience, but of racial exposure to white hate, because the N word, I'm not going to use this word in English, but the Negro is an invention of of a white madness, okay? And I think that blackness is a way to escape from this craziness that reshaped the world through the color line. And if we understand blackness this way, it is a political project. But after, what we put inside this political project has to do with our political opinions and all our political commitment in this world. And I think that those political commitments are different. So to me, it's still complicated. But I think that in a way, being black or to have something to do with blackness is to be confronted in your own life to this following aporia. How do I escape from this I that invented me as a Negro? And I think that this question is shared in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, and in Asia. So I don't know if I think it would be easier if I could see you, because we could have a more engaging conversation. But to me, it's a very, very important question. After I didn't hear all the question, but I would love to point the problem of melancholia. I think that I don't know if it is possible to understand the question of the return in a non-melancholic way, because what I wanted to do is just to draw kind of joyful political practices and to say that the question of return just means that we still want to go back, not because we have lost something, but because we have to create a new thing. And it is more in this way that I understand the question of the return than in a melancholic way. Because, I don't know, the people who want to return just show something, is that they have not lost anything. They have not lost, that's why they are now just moving to create a new way to reshape the world. So I wouldn't say that this understanding of return is melancholic or linked to melancholia. And after, there is only a second, this paper is longer. And there was a part of this paper that I erased for this lecture because it would have been too long. And I know that it was a video conference, and sometimes it's not very easy just to listen to somebody talking through a screen. But there is an experience I didn't want also to use is to understand the diaspora, or what is an Afro-diasporic life, through the concept of Afropolitanism. I think I didn't talk at all about Afropolitanism, and the kind of diaspora the kind of diasporic life I want to understand has nothing to do with a kind of a praise of Afropolitanism. I think that the idea of Afropolitanism is really interesting to undermine the conservative conception of nation state rooted in identity, homogeneical identity. But I think it had the critics are very well known now, are very famous. But I think that it has also a very it is a promotion of a very neoliberal understanding of multiple identities that are, new expression of the adaptability of people, able to be flexible and to respond to the demands of the market. And my comprehension of diaspora has nothing to do with this understanding of Afropolitanism. It's more a kind of a grassroots, popular understanding of what an Afro-diasporic life can be. And it is also described by all the the questions and the kind of experiences I can see also in my country. And just to answer to the last part of your question, you were talking about the question of the task, the practical task. I remember I support a woman in France. I don't know, perhaps you have heard about her, I don't know, because I think that her fight now is very famous. But, we all have police brutalities in my country, police brutalities against especially black men and Arabic men. And there was 3 years ago, a black young man, innocent, he didn't do anything, was just biking in the streets, who was killed by the police in the police building. And the family did, his name is Adama Traoré, and his family is now fighting just to get the truth and the justice. But what happened is that there was a lot of harassment against this family. 2 of the brothers of this man called Adama were put in jail for just nothing. And now you have this confrontation between the state and all those families. And the sister of Adama Traoré, called Assa Traoré, has done a lot to fight for the justice. And what was interesting is that we were talking together about the possibilities of the diasporic life. How can we do? Why is it important to be Afrodiasporic, to be part of France, and to be part, for example, for her it was Mali, for me it was DRC, etc. And what was interesting, for example, is that she was received by the president of the Malian country. She's from Mali and she lives in France, but she never was received by the president of France. I mean, François Hollande first, and now Emmanuel Macron. So it is interesting to see how, those questions of diasporas are always politics, because it shows how we have, for example, and it is one of the goals of the fight for the justice and the truth for Adama Traoré, how we have to reinvent, this country, France, that is still built on racial lines. This group, also with beyond the question of justice and truth, is to rebuild and to reshape the idea that France has for itself as a white Christian country that has always hide this idea, those concrete identities under the veil of universalism. And this is one of their fight. And I think it's a very concrete fight because it has a lot of consequences in the everyday lives of people. And after, I don't know about the question of the what we call the afterlives of Westphalian logic. How the question, if I hear the question, it was how the logic of diaspora is still trapped in this Westphalian spirit and the idea of the nation state. I think it's a good question, and I think that this is the difficulty of the concept of diaspora itself, of course. And I think also that perhaps Marion Strass gives a good answers to these problems that you cannot escape from the. But I think that one of the questions is how can you rebuild a concept of diaspora that escapes from the majority narratives and the idea that the nation states gives you your ontological consistency. And I think that it is possible if you have a very materialistic and political understanding of what being double presence in a very inadequate way is. The answer can seem very abstract, but when I see the kind of expressions can have, the kind of a concrete material fight it can nurture or fuel, I think it's not abstract at all.
Thank you. I think that Alejandro, yes, we're going to take 3 more questions on this side, and then we're going to move to the right. Purely yes? Directional terms.
Okay. Do you hear me? Yes?
Yeah, I do hear you very well.
Great. Well, thank you for your brilliant presentation. I was just wondering if literature, contemporary African literature or diasporic literature, has been of any help inventing this at an imaginary level, inventing these new ways of inhabiting, of which you've been talking about. I mean, if you could say something about this. No? That's my question.
I didn't hear the end of your question.
The end?
Yeah, because I have the impression that something fries.
Okay, I'm going to repeat it. No, it's just if literature has been of any help creating at an imaginary level new ways or new forms of inhabiting, no? The ones you've been talking about, no? What's been the role of literature in this new diasporic conception of inhabiting?
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, great. I have maybe a related question. I wondered about the role of language in your analysis, or the potential role of language in your analysis. You said a little bit about it in response to Adriana's question about the written tradition. But communities are language communities. There is a nationalist politics of language which can construct it as a kind of shibboleth, the ideology of the mother tongue, etc. On the other hand, there are other ways of thinking about what it is to be in language, and other ways of imagining and inhabiting language communities that are more, as it were, co-creative and would seem to be more in line with your theorization of solidarity as opposed to identity. Language is something that people can feel that they belong to, I suppose. Feeling at home for me is very much a matter of feeling in a kind of language place rather than a geographical place. So I wondered if I wondered whether there needed to be a sort of explicit theorization of language in relation to your argument, and if so, what that would be like.
Hello, Yala, can you hear me? Yes. Well, thank you for your marvelous presentation. I was thinking about that idea of blackness and the migration, and I was thinking about all the migrants from Haiti that are living here in Chile. And I was also thinking about the idea of Arroyo that says that migrants are self-translated beings because they have to learn the language of the other culture. They have to not just learn the language, they have to talk like the other culture, they have to dress like the other culture, and act like the other culture in general terms. So I was thinking, is that desire to return, or that desire will be the possibility to be an untranslatable being, an untranslated being, or the quest for the untranslatable, the quest for who you are in general terms. And then will the idea of return a way to revert to zero, like if nothing has happened in the past related to the migration?
Okay. Have you got them all, Yala?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all those marvelous questions. You give a lot to think. First, with the question of language, I think it's a difficult it's a difficult question, not because it's of course it has to do with the question of nationalist politics, but when you think in the context of the relation between the ancient colonies and the ancient colonized countries, you have to understand the question of language through the problem of, I think, imperialism. And I think that one of the best thinkers for that is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who was the marvelous person who thought about that. And of course, the question of language has something to do with the belonging. But I don't know if, but I think that the relation in the diasporic, for example, experiences, what is interesting to understand is what kind of languages usually the people who have a diasporic lives have been learning, what kind of languages do they use, in what situations, and are the people who are living in Europe but who were born in Africa, what kind of languages they are just talking. And I think that what would be interesting is not perhaps to have a big theorization of the question of languages, but it's to understand how through the uses of languages, the fact of not knowing the languages perhaps of your father or your mother for several questions, how it brings a very specified experiences of what it means to be in diaspora. I know that my answer is not very precise, but just for one reason, because I have a kind of interferences with my own experience and what happened to me. And I know that the worst way to answer to a question is to answer with a personal experience, but I will assume it and answer very badly to your question, but I assume it. But I had I had a conference, I had a meeting once, and we had to understand what was, it was for the radio, national, it was for the national radio in France, but the national radio that is made for the African people, we call that RFI. So it is the big mass media that we have in France that are emitting to Africa. And there was this big day called the journey of the birthday of the Francophonie. You know that it is a big institution and that our present president wants to rebuild, to renew, to make it cooler. These are those terms. The idea of Francophonie to regrasp and to reshape the relation of France between all the ancient colonized country. And there was this big day with the celebrating the idea of Francophonie. And I was asking a kind of a question about the languages. And I had to say that the question of languages, the way you bring the language of your mother or your father coming from another country and how you mix it with the new country you have settled in, usually draws a history of violence. The reason why I was born in Belgium, when my father comes from the DRC, that is to say, in the colonial country of the DRC, is rooted in an experience of violence. It's just because the independencies of failed and a lot of rebels and political fighters for freedom could not have the possibility against the Mobutu regime to stay in their country. And this history takes a very concrete form in the way you use or you take a language. French is my language, but I always heard Lingala and Kikongo in my personal life. And I don't know, it is not through the exclusive possession of this language that the question of return, for example, appeared to me or appeared to many people of the African diaspora. But the question of language usually, and the reappropriation of the African language for the people who couldn't have the possibility to learn them in Europe, for example, is always seen as a way to fight against new form of imperialism. That's really what Cheikh Anta Diop said. We have to reinvent in African languages, we have to redo our African languages, and I think that the people who want to return in a very political way want to take back those languages to reinvent and to renew the possibility of creating in non-imperial languages. And it's more in this situation that the question of the language is coming in my paper, not as an expression of, not as a way to belong more, or not as a way to legitimize, the belonging of someone to a community. And what is interesting also is that we always talk about languages, but we never talk about the way we talk those languages. We speak with them. And you always have the question of the accent. That is always an expression also of your inadequacy. You can speak very fluently in Lingala, but with this horrible French accent that I have in every languages when I speak a foreign language, for example, people see that you are not so assimilated. So a language is not only, a formal way, but it's also, I would say, something that shows by the way you use it, the history and the history of violence that your life sometimes can carry. About the question of the return, I think I had problem to understand the last question with the blackness. You were talking about the Haitian migration in Chile, and I think that there is a great a sociologist who talks a lot about the question of race and blackness in Chile. She's the mother of this great singer. I don't remember her name. Sorry, I miss it. I think she has written a lot about this question of racial consciousness in Chile. But I didn't hear, not understand, but I didn't hear the question of the quest of return linked to the question of Haitian immigration in Chile. Could you repeat?
Yes, I was thinking about the return as an idea of a way to revert to zero in general terms.
Okay, I understand now.
Okay, thank you.
No, it's not. Yes, thank you. I didn't have this part. It's not a way to return to zero, and I don't know what zero means exactly. And it's not a way to erase the past. I think that there is. The idea of return is not doesn't mean there was coloniality, there was colonialism, but now we have to erase it and to go back to where we should belong. Without this tragedy of history, it has nothing to do with that. The idea of return, the show, is a very, very clear historical consciousness of what happened. And it means that we have to understand all the consequences of what happened and to show how we can recreate or retransform certain part of the world. I believe, as many great Latin American thinker, that there is that you don't have one word, but a plurality of words. And the question of return is how can we rebuild another word? That is not shaped by a certain kind of violence that have a long history. So it's not to return to zero, and it's not a kind of a tabula rasa that would say we don't want to face the tragedy of history. It is just a way, to try to retransform certain part of the world in a very concrete way. And what I love with this idea of diaspora is that I'm still close and I still feel the question of internationalism. But what is complicated is the way with the idea of internationalism, how you always have the idea that there is only one way to think about this world, one way to understand what could be an emancipatory process shared by all the people. And what is interesting with the idea of diaspora is that the solidarities are always local and situated. And that what you have to think is how, when it is linked with the parts of the world that have conflictual relationships, economical, etc., how do you rebuild or reshape, those parts of the world? And I think that it will allow me to conclude with the last question of literature. I think that there are a lot of literature about that. about this idea that perhaps the idea of diasporic life, I mean, could reshape some parts of the world. Of course, in the ancient, when I think about even somebody like Léopold Sédar Senghor or Césaire, I think that all their works is about this question: how our situation, how our Black situation allows us to reinvent another version of the world. And for example, I think the book of Gary Wilder, Freedom Time, was very the exposure of this idea, and the way he reads, I mean, Césaire and Senghor, is totally linked to this. And actually, I think that was for the in contemporary literature. I don't see here now what kind of in Africa, what kind of a writer could express that. Perhaps more in Europe. I mean, perhaps somebody, a woman like Leonora Miano, would be, that is between the Europe and, I mean, France and Cameroon, could be an expression of this, an embodiment of this material way to understand the diaspora. And I think she would be a good expression of that. Because what I like with her is that she's very rooted in a very materialistic way to think about the political question, and she's not only into the idea of. She doesn't all the time promote the idea of multiple identities as if it would be something that would, of course, change the world. And that's why I think her work will be, for me, a perfect embodiment of perhaps those ideas, but you have to recreate the way you read it to perhaps see it. I don't know, but I would quote her. I would give her name.
Yala, thank you so much. We're running out of time, so I don't think we're going to have time to move to the right of our room. Sorry, guys. Just to say, it's, I mean, the fascinating continuities with, there's a political theorist and philosopher from South Africa who you might be aware of, Steve Biko, who, when he was asked about what his project of Black consciousness was about, if it was about toppling apartheid, he said, no, there's no question about toppling apartheid. It's going to fall anyway. The task is making people ready. And he was thinking of the interventions of people like Césaire, who, for whom the future comes. And the question is, how do we make ourselves, you frozen? Oh, no, you're listening. How do we make ourselves ready for the invention of that future that might come? And I found your talk incredibly productive in thinking diaspora not as something that produces particularities, much like translation in Matthew's talk from a few days ago produces the fixity of language, but rather as a mechanism that might produce diversity and openness in that question of invention, while not forgetting the weight of Blackness. So I thank you so much for your talk, and it's a real pity that you can't be here to sit with us over lunch so we can chat further, but thank you very, very, very much.
And thank you for... And I would like to thank you for being patient with my accent and for being for this particular situation. And thank you for your understanding. I would have loved to be here, but it was not possible, sorry, unfortunately. Thank you a lot.